Good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's David here at Tribal Habits, and we're due to kick off our next best practices webinar. Today, we're diving into using images in online learning. And I can still see lots of people joining now as we're getting started. So I'll just take a few seconds to overview what we're going to cover. Hopefully you can all see my screen. I'm going to use again a Tribal Habits topic just to step us through some practical considerations here. In a previous session, we looked at the use of video. And today we're looking at the use of images. Obviously, they are partners to each other, and we will discuss that at one point today as well. I'm going to start, though, by talking about the power of images in online learning, and perhaps a particular theme I want to focus on about what I often use images for. Not always. We'll look at various uses of them, but a real key theme for it. Then in fact, two, we're going to dive into a bunch of different ways to actually use them, the practical parts, and show you some demonstrations of them in action. We'll use some Tribal Habits tools for that, but we'll just look at some general tips as well. Then we're going to finish with some practical considerations just around working with media and just a few best practices and common mistakes to avoid. I'm going to get straight into things. I'm going to tell you we are going to do a little bit of interaction in this first thing. So I'm hoping you can all find the chat box because you're going to need it in about 45 seconds from now. I'm going to ask everyone to type one word into the chat box in about 45 seconds from now, once I've done the following thing. So let's get started. We're going to dive into fact one, and I'm going to put some images on the screen, and I'm going to slowly scroll down the screen for about 40 seconds, and then I'll ask you to type in one word, and the images are going to tell a story. I'm going to pause there. If you'd like to play along, I'd like you to go into the chat box and type in a word that you're thinking about, having just watched that little story with those images. It could be any word you like. Yep, excellent. I got some answers coming in straight away. Now, I didn't speak while we were doing that. There's no words on the screen. It was purely images. That's all it was. And I've got words like loss, journey, which is very interesting, loyal, misunderstood, unfortunate. In other words, I haven't got the same word from everybody, but I've got a response. And while some of them are to do with loss, with sadness, with something, other interpretations of this story are on more positive things like loyalty, or that the dog was misunderstood from its actions earlier on. And I think this is one of the secret little power things of images. Everyone has some sort of a response to that sequence of images. I think images are very interesting, emotive, and provoking to humans. We're very visual creatures, and we react strongly to visual stimulus. And it's not to say that images are the best or only method of provoking a reaction or learning, but I think they're very important, and they can achieve things the spoken or written word cannot. I'm not sure I could have got those responses from today's audience by me describing that story with words in the same way I could have got with no words and just images. I think images are also particularly important for online learning, where words can tend to dominate the experience at time. I want to talk about two examples in particular here. The first thing is, I think people relate easily to images because our brains are hardwired to interpret images. When we think in images. So images are our natural thought process. And I think images talk to our subconscious mind in a way that words cannot. They stimulate responsive images to ourselves, and they trigger memories and associated feelings. And because of this stimulated association, this provocative use of emotion or imagination, I think images help with making connections. They help with memorization. They help with recall. So they can be a very efficient tool. And when you think about what we're trying to achieve in learning, we were often trying to achieve memorization or learning or recall or change. Images are a great way to stimulate the parts of the mind that help those things to happen. And so in some respects, images in online training could be a good primer. They're a good way to activate learners in an online environment or to continue to stimulate important parts of the thought process, which will help them accept the words that we're using. And so I'm going to look today at a range of image techniques which go from everything from decorative through to learning. But I just want to keep that thought in mind that even when we're using decorative images, there's a way that can be supporting the underlying knowledge transfer or learning behaviors we're trying to get. The final thing I'll look at in this starting part here is the types of images we can play with online. And I'm going to look at a couple different ones. And in the next fact, I'll look at how we use them. So the first type of image we can use is a custom photo. And everyone these days has got a fantastic camera in their pocket. It's really easy to whip it out and take photos. And if you're creating online training on just about anything, it's not hard at all to look around where you are and start taking photos, particularly if you're in an office environment, which in the land of COVID is a little rarer, but when you are, there's usually things around your office, be it team members, people, activities that are happening, staged setups for role plays or demonstrations of stuff, or just decorative images that have your brand or people in it. Taking those photos is simple and easy. There's also great access to stock photo now. I think this is probably the biggest difference in the last 10 years, is your ability to access stock photos for free. So there are great free libraries around. There's one in Tribal Habits we integrate with, and there's a bunch of others that give you very high quality photos on a range of things for free. And as I'll talk about later, they're typically royalty free too. It's easy to take a screenshot. So looking down at my computer, I have a print screen button. You will probably have the same thing. So it's easy to bring things up on my computer, hit print screen, and then with a very small amount of editing, which you could even do inside of Tribal Habits, you've got the content that you need. And that could be for a screenshot like this, where we're teaching someone about software or a website, or it could be for a document. So this document image here was created in Microsoft Word. I just hit print screen and I have myself a copy of the document. So while you can download documents, you may sometimes want to have images of those documents as well that you can mark up and edit or let people look at. I'm also thinking about graphics. So in this case here, I've got a bit of a flow chart that was created using Smart Art in Microsoft PowerPoint. I'll talk more about Smart Art later. It's a really powerful tool for online learning and it allows me to create custom graphics really easy. You can also get characters. Here's 5 characters we use in one of our training courses. We got these characters from a character library that we purchased. It was very cheap. I think it was like 20 bucks and we got 40 different poses for a character. So we spent 100 bucks, got 5 characters with 40 poses. And we can use those as little avatars or characters when we're explaining content. Finally, you could use it as a label, which I'll talk about as well. A label is where you have an image that has a label on it, and you might use this as a repetitive, almost like an icon. And then whenever you're talking about this thing, this comes up. So in this case here, my label is analytical. And the most common use for this that I see is when you have a training course or a module that has maybe 4 different stages or steps or versions or types, and you give a label with a color or an image to each one. And each time you talk about that step or phase, you use that image again to reinforce it. And that visual representation is increasing the memorization and the linkages with your learners. So we think about, we've got the easy ability to get images in and to use them as a provocative stimulus, as a way to not just break up text, but actually activate critical learner's mind. Let's keep that in mind. And the second part, I'm going to go into how we use this in a variety of ways. Now, as I'm going through this and showing you these activities, if you have questions about it, feel free to jump into the chat box and ask questions, or to use the Q&A function. I've got both open to do that. Let's go have a look at some images in online learning. And I'm going to start with images as decoration. So the first great use of images is just to give some white space, to break up the text, just to bring some color onto the page so it's not screen after screen or page after page of text. And these images here, which are high resolution, professionally shot images, are all right out of our image library. I actually just used the word decoration as the search term and then just selected these images that came back. And they're beautiful, high quality images that I can drop in at any point. And one of the most common things I do as a designer is this header style image. So this image here of this table has been cropped into this specific ratio, and it doesn't need to be this exact ratio, but it's a long, thin rectangle, which I think suits most people's devices. So I'll talk about it a little bit later, but most people are typically using a landscape style of screen. They might use a mobile in portrait if you have a lot of mobile users, but I still think most people, when they're doing corporate-based or serious online training, are on a tablet, a laptop, or a desktop. And so having this widescreen sort of image fits very well. And by cropping it as well, I just allow it to sit somewhere. So if I just jump back into editing mode for the moment, and I'm going to start a new section in here, and let's call this section a new section. And it might be that underneath that, I'm going to have a whole lot of text. So I'll just grab some ipsum lorem to chuck in as my text. So I've got all this text kind of coming up here. And to break this thing up, I'm going to use a decorative header image. And so to do that, I'm just going to insert the image here. So I can just insert an image here. And I could upload my own image, or I can just go to our stock photo library. I'm just going to search for the word new and see what comes back. This woman with the sparkler will do nicely. But this is a bit of a big image. It's taking up a fair bit of space. So I'm going to open our image editor. And I'm going to go to the crop tab. And under aspect ratio, we have a bunch of ready-made ratios. And the one I like to use for this situation is header. And it automatically cuts it to this nice rectangular style. And then I can just drag the image to focus on the part that I want, which is really the sparkler. So I'm just chopping out all of the bottom of the image and save. And now I've created this kind of heading with a header image and then my content. And I think this flow works very well from a decorative point of view. Later, when we're talking about emotions, we may pick a more serious image here to stimulate the sort of emotion we're looking for in this particular section. But I'll get to that a little bit later. If I just go back and hit refresh here now, I'll see when I open a new section, I've got the new section with my cropped image and the text. And that kind of sits nicely as a nice flow of information. The next thing I can be using images for is inspiration. So like a classic one here would be a quote. So I've just used our quote element. I've grabbed a quote from Dr. Seuss and I've put a picture of the person who is the author, Dr. Seuss, in there. That's the obvious way to do inspiration with an image, but I could do a little bit better. So here I've got two scenarios. So in this case here, I might be running an activity where I'm going to ask the learner to respond to something, to respond to a scenario. And in this scenario, they've just returned to their desk to find someone has spilled coffee on it. But what I've done is I've added an image of the scenario. And I know this seems like 101, but I see a lot of e-learning that doesn't do this, that just has the text for the scenario and has several paragraphs explaining the scenario. But if I really want to stimulate someone's response to it, get their real actual kind of intellectual or emotional response to it, having an image of that scenario activates that part. It activates those emotions. Looking at this, I would be very annoyed if I came back and saw that. And I'm reinforcing that annoyance in them before they answer the question. And I don't think I can stimulate them the same way just using this text. Equally here, I may have a scenario. In this case, Sandra's a training facilitator running an in-house workshop and something happens and my learners need to suggest some responses or do something. And by putting a picture of the person in this case, I'm helping them get into the shoes of that person. I'm helping them get into the moment, the age of this person, their gender, how they're feeling, what's going on in the room. And I think I get a higher quality of response from them by stimulating them with this image. And so in this case here, I'm using the images as inspiration, as stimulation for a response. I don't need them, but I think it improves the quality of response that I get. Indeed, I could do that with emotions if I just want to go a purely emotional tact here. So if I think back to that header image I put in with the woman with the sparkler, let's say I had some content that was about success, about where I wanted people as they're reading it to feel inspired, to feel like they can do it, to feel like this is going to make a difference. Well, perhaps starting with a header image that has that underlying emotion helps quietly appeal to their subconscious in that area. And so this picture of these kids looking super happy, it's hard not to look at that image and not feel like, yeah, I want some of that. What's on the screen? I want to know what's on the screen. And it's a subtle thing, but again, it's lighting up little things in their mind. Equally, this image, which is darker, of the man with the head in his hands and obviously feeling a moment of stress or of depression or of anguish, possibly even anger. There's a variety of ways this image could be used. Could be setting the right tone for content that is more serious or where I need people to feel the content as they read it and perhaps appreciate the seriousness of it. And so in these two cases, I'm using the images in a decorative way, but to stimulate a very particular emotion, not just to create white space or color on the screen. We can obviously also use images for explanation. So in this case here, I've got a guy doing some welding. I've just got some ipsum lorem text here on the side, but in reality, it would be talking about the welding and what they're doing and seeing this. And this is a classic way, obviously, to do some training. Perhaps a more classic way would be step by step, where we're using images here. And I'm just using a 50-50 split on images versus captions. And I'm just talking someone through 3 steps. And they could be 3 photos I've taken on my phone of someone working through something, or 3 screenshots of a document being completed, or 3 screenshots of software working through a function or an outcome in software. I'll talk about it a little more later, or I'll reinforce it, but a little thing I've done here is I've used a square crop ratio on each image. The fact that I've used square doesn't matter too much. Square does work nicely on this 50-50 split, but more importantly, I think it creates consistency in the images. And when I see that consistency, it's a bit of unity for the learner. It's a bit of professionalism from your part. And it was nothing more than me opening the image editor, choosing square and hitting crop. But that consistency here, which is a key theme I'll talk about later, looks better. And I think it's a little more engaging for the learners as well. You can also use images for signposting. So I often have images sent in, which we review, where there's commonly a quiz at the end of each point. And one thing you could do is to use the same image at the start of each of those sections. It could be as simple as this one here, which says quiz. Alternatively, I see topics where you ask the learner to make a decision for later, to add it to their journal or to take some notes in something. And indeed, you could have this image of the man with the notebook each time you ask for that. So the images at this point have an actual function. They're signposting. So they're adding some extra navigation in a way. And every time the learner sees this, they know, having seen it before, what they're supposed to do. So it's improving the efficiency of training for the learner. They got it right. I see it. Every time I see this image, I know the text under it's going to ask me to add something to my journal. So it's speeding them through the activity instructions in a way. And it's easy just to have a few of these at hand and use them repetitively. They don't need to be this big. You could easily crop this one. So if I go back and find that image here, I could crop it even harder by opening the image editor if I just want to have a really thin strip, and really just crop this down to focus on the hand. And now that's going to be my signposted image, which I'll use whenever I'm going to ask someone to commit to something or do something. So I just scroll back down to that. This then becomes image used as signposting. We can also use images in our interactions. And so a simple one here is I've just created a flip card setup where I'm using images as the titles. There's no other words. And they're clicking on each one to see what lies behind. Now, not only am I using images on the front, the interaction itself is an image. The flip cards are an image. So I'm using the interactions to create images as well. And in this way here, the flip card image has implied knowledge that if I click on it, it flips and I'll see what's on the other side. And there's a relationship between the front and the back. I don't need to explain any of that. That's kind of implied in the setup here. Equally, I could use an interaction where I'm using a series of buttons. So here I am repeating the interaction we saw earlier. So up here we had the step-by-step ones. Here they are. So we had step 1, step 2, step 3. And now I'm actually turning them into an interaction. This is the exact same image and text, but I'm using the button interaction to do that. And the buttons themselves are images. So I now have layered images here. So the images as buttons tells people, right, there's 3 steps. I got to click through it. By clicking on this image of the step 1, I get this information here. I'm now moving my hand on the mouse, which is improving all of my linkages in my own mind between step 1 and this image, and then clicking for step 2 and this image. I know these things seem subtle, and somewhat, in some respects they are, but anything we can do to activate the mind and stimulate the mind helps with retention of learning. Another important way or useful way to use an image is to make the image itself the interaction. So in this case, I'm talking about Hotspot. So in this case here, I have 7 bits of information I want to talk about with my learner. And I've used a hotspot element to put them on this image of coins stacked into 7 columns. And I've just aligned each of the numbers of one of the coins. And of course, if I click on a number, I get the information that lies behind it. Now, this could be a screenshot of software, and then you're making each of the menus on the software a clickable element to explain what the menus do. Or it could be a screenshot of a document which has various components to it, and then you're going to have information icons about each of the components on the document. Or it could just be a decorative way to use it. So here I've used a graphic. I've used a smart art from PowerPoint. So I went into PowerPoint, I selected smart art. I've just called them item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then PowerPoint has a great function where you can change the file type. So under the info menu, when you go to save it, below saving, there's another choice to change file type, and you can export your slides as images. So I exported this slide as an image and then just uploaded the slide directly into a hotspot. The slide had a white background, so you can't actually see the background here. It looks like it's embedded in there. And then I just added these question mark where if they click on each one, they learn about item 1. And Smart Art in PowerPoint has flowcharts, it has pyramids, it has Venn diagrams, it has quadrant diagrams. So if you're finding that you've got 4 or 5 bits of text and perhaps one of the interaction layouts isn't working, it's very easy to go into PowerPoint, create that Smart Art, export it as a file, so export it as an image type, and upload it, and we're done. And we've now used an image to help with the hierarchy of this knowledge. We should also talk about video. So we discussed video in a longer session separately, and I think they're both important elements of media, videos and images. Videos are great for demonstration. They're very engaging, and you can show the whole of something. So if I'm showing a role play, I can show the whole of the role play in one go, and that could be very effective. Images are moments in a video. So they have some advantages over video. First of all, they're very good for reference. So you can study an image very carefully and easily. They can be printed, they can be viewed as much as you want. They can be annotated. So you can draw arrows and circles and highlight them and point out very specific things on the image. They don't rush by like a video does. I'm sure we've all been watching a video and we've had to pause it and go back and we want to see that thing again. We don't have the problems with images. You can spend as much time as you like looking at each image in the sequence or the series. And they're very easy to both create and consume. They don't require any audio, which can often be a problem for video playback in an environment that has no speakers. So images can work well there. I actually think they work well as a set. And sometimes I say to people, actually don't use video, use a series of images instead for the reasons I've outlined there. And software training is often one of them. I typically only recommend using video if there's a lot of action, a lot of things happening. Often when I'm doing software training, it's like, click on this menu, click here and do this thing, click here and do that. But each of those clicks could be represented by a single image instead of a video. Those images are faster to create and easier for me to follow. They can work well as a team though, where it's important that someone sees a flow. So I think about something like martial arts. It might be handy as a martial arts student to see a series of images which show a throw or a joint lock. But actually, at the end of the day, you also want to see the video of how that all works together and all the little moves and footwork and all the little segues between those images. So sometimes I recommend that you might use a series of images to initially outline how a process works, a role play or a skill or something. And then at the very end, you might have a video which puts it all together, shows an end-to-end example. That would be best practice of using both. A final option for using images as video would be to use our narration element. So if you haven't used narration before, it's a series of slides which have a voiceover on each slide. So in this case here, I've used the images that we had from step 1, step 2, and step 3 above. It's just automatically moving for them and it's reading out the script for each. I've essentially turned these images into video, but I've done it in a much faster way than having to create a video. Now, there were a lot of different options I went through there, and we're going to run out of time shortly. I've just got to cover a few practical things. If you want to discuss any scenarios that I just went through there with me, you can let me know in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll run through that with you. While you're thinking of questions, I'm just going to quickly cover off on some really important practical stuff, starting with the technical stuff. So when it comes to using images in online training, I recommend you're very consistent with your images. Consistency might mean regular crop sizes. So always using headers for decorative images or always using squares when you're explaining things. I think that consistency brings unity to your module. It could be consistency in color, where you use a similar color palette or similar set of images in a theme. So you're always using people or landscapes or metaphors, or consistency in style. I think what we want to avoid is that 1990s clip art feeling where you're randomly grabbing just metaphor images that are all completely different in different sizes and different colors and different layouts. That looks like a bit of a jumbled mess. But if you can say, you know what, I'm just going to use photos and I'm always going to crop them to header, or I'm just going to use things from a color palette that's bright or dark or faded or black and white, those little things, they're not much of a big decision and they add a ton of unity and consistency and professionalism. Next, use high resolution images. I'm really not mucking around on this one. Every screen is high definition. Even my iPhone is like 2,500 pixels of resolution. Any low resolution image these days is immediately revealed. You should be using images that are at least 1,000 pixels wide. If you're going to use an image from an online document or website, zoom in on it as much as you can, then do your screenshot, and then you can always allow it to shrink to fit the screen, but if someone does zoom in on it, it'll have all that resolution that you need. Make sure you crop the image. Crop the image to remove unnecessary parts of it, to allow it to focus, to reduce its file size. Most learners typically have a landscape screen, so I'm typically recommending a landscape crop or a square crop. I'm only using a portrait crop if I know that a lot of my learners are on mobile, which I still feel is reasonably rare. Make sure you save the file efficiently too. All online files are being downloaded or streamed every time someone does your training. You shouldn't be using images that are 2 megabytes in size. I generally recommend using the JPEG format, and you can usually get to compression of at least 50%. So whatever image thing you're using will usually do that for you. If you're using the Tribal Habits image library, it does all that automatically for you. You should use the PNG format, which some of you might have seen. I am getting a little technical now, where you're using very simple images like graphics or flowcharts or smart art. They will actually lead to a much sharper image for those very simple images, and they can be very small images too. But do not use PNG for any colorful images like this laptop here. It'll be a massive file size. I am not a big fan of GIFs. I know some people like using animated GIFs, but they can be horrendously large. You can easily get GIFs that are 5, 10, or 15 megabytes in size. They can take 30 seconds to download, at which point someone's moved on in the training and not even seen it. So I generally recommend avoiding them and using a video instead. There are some other modern formats, but for images you might have heard about, I would typically not recommend them at the moment because there's many browsers that don't support them. So we're typically JPEG for colorful things and photos, and PNG for graphics and smart art. Finally, you can annotate your images as appropriate. That's one of the advantages of them. So why don't I just go and have a bit of a quick play here with this, we want this laptop here. And I want to annotate this because I want to really focus some people on a few things in it. So I'm going to open the image editor and I'm going to go to markup. And I really want to highlight people around this mouse. So I'm going to kind of put a circle on the mouse and get them to focus on that. There. And if I wanted to, I could go even further and add in an arrow just to really get them to look at that bit there. And so now I'm really getting people to kind of focus on what I want in this. And this is one of the advantage over media, is that I can very easily annotate them to point to things or highlight them or put the A's and B's or to put crosses or whatever I like. So annotating them is definitely an advantage that you can get over video. A couple of key mistakes. As much as I've talked well about images here, like all design tools, we want to avoid overusing them. So we don't need a header image for every section. Then they lose their fun part, their uniqueness. We just want little bits of them every now and then just to help break it up like everything else. We also want to be careful with a few things to do with text with image. And the first one is overlays. So let's go down and edit this image here. And I'm going to put some text over the image. So let's say I want to type in the name of the city. That looks like Chicago to me. And of course, I want to do my brand color, which is gray. And the problem with that is it's not going to have trouble kind of finding the right place to put it here because it kind of doesn't have very good contrast. So I have to be very careful with this sort of overlay. So typically what we recommend is you start by putting in something that the text can sit on. So I might just put this white background here to give better contrast. And at that point, I can then add my text, which is Chicago. And I can even make it that light gray if I wanted to. And now it's going to really pop, and I can just put the text behind it like that. Now I have something that's very easy to read, particularly on smaller devices or lower resolution screens. So when I'm looking to do overlays, I'm generally wanting to put a background behind it to make the text pop. Also, be very careful with images that have very small and thin fonts. So here I have a screenshot of CNN from a few days ago, and it has some very small fonts here, which are actually quite hard to read. However, I did a very high resolution version of this, which allows people to zoom in and improve that font. I often see people do screenshots of documents and they don't do it at a high enough resolution, put in the document and it's just not legible. Better to make that document as big as you can. Let the screen zoom it in if they need, like shrink it if they need to, but then you can zoom in to get this extra level of detail. I've gone a little bit over my 30 minutes today, but I have covered everything that I wanted to cover with about an extra 2 minutes. I've gone for 32 minutes. I do appreciate you coming along today. Images are really easy to use in online training, and hopefully, particularly in Fact 2, I've given you a few ways to get images in there to both lighten up your training, to use some new tools that you haven't seen before, but also to stimulate your learners' minds, to improve their connections or engagement with the training that you've got. I'm going to wrap up the formal part of the session here. If you'd like to hang around to ask me any questions, I'm in no rush. I'll go through with them. Otherwise, thanks for joining us, and I'll see you at our next Best Practices workshop.